law school, and I ran against a woman who lived on Eastwood Boulevard named Henrietta Acapora. Some you know, right? You remember Henrietta?
Yeah. We know her.
You know her, yeah. Anybody who doesn't know her? Henrietta, the younger ones don't, right? Okay, yeah, but only two. Most everybody else does. Yeah, Henny is gone now, but she was your town clerk for many years, and then she ran in 1981, and I was a renegade against her, and she clobbered me. She destroyed me. It wasn't even it was not even remotely close, and so I have learned the power of a woman, believe me. And so it was with Henny. So anyway, I'm glad to be here tonight and say hello to you all and introduce you to, I guess, what I can say. Now, we've done this, I think, Gina, how many things, 6 times?
About 6, yeah.
We've done this about 6 times, and each time I try to alter, make it a little different, because these are streamed through Gina. She films them, and they usually get streamed, so people watch them, and if they come back and it's the same thing, it's just not as exciting or interesting at all. But it's pretty hard to keep changing the speech about the same facts. I mean, the facts are the facts, the evidence is the evidence. So I'll try to alter the way I approach it if you have seen the others, and try to make it a little more interesting in that respect. We'll try it, see. Well, first, I think it's fair to say that the best way to approach any kind of a case when you watch all these true crime movies and shows that are on now, they're so popular apparently, but if you really listen carefully, I think the most effective speakers on those shows are those who stay with the evidence, that they emphasize the evidence. And so that's what I try to do as well, is make every case all about the evidence, and then let the evidence speak for itself. And you can then draw in your minds from the evidence that which you think is true. And if I just say, this is true, well, you know, then you're like those who say, you know, I used to encounter them once in a while. The teacher said it, I believe it, and that's all there is to it. And I was a teacher, so I know that many teachers that teach like that or taught like that, right? And I don't want you to do that. I'm not here to say, Ray said it, therefore it must be true. But instead, what is the evidence? How does it speak to you? And so, using, I guess, Sherlock Holmes, evidence, always evidence. That's the rule. That's the rule. And if you stay with that rule, you'll get to where you want to go with the conclusions. But there's a second rule. And that second rule, it's a good rule to use when you write, when you think. And that is to simply say true things in the right order. It's a pretty good rule. Say true things in the right order. How do you do that? Well, you do that with the evidence. And you speak about evidence. So when I came into this case, and that was back in mid-December of 2011, I'm going to get to the point, I know, where some of you weren't born yet, and I'll still be talking about this case. But way back to 2011, in December, the police, the Suffolk County Police Department, had been investigating the entire Gilgo Beach, Oak Beach case for several years, depending upon who disappeared and when. But that investigation can stretch all the way back easily to 2007 and before that, depending upon who you want to count as being someone related to the other murders. It can go all the way back to 1982, where there were unsolved murders. I'm thinking of the lady Tina Foglia, who disappeared at what was it, Hammerheads I think it was, the bar, and was never found again. And that was in 1982. She disappeared allegedly after she had met a young doctor at Hammerheads. And so you can stretch your mind all the way back to that point, say, are these all related? They might be, but you need the evidence to say they are. But certainly, as to the Gilgo / Oak Beach 11 people, they seem to be related at least by, in most of those cases, profession and geography. This is a great big graveyard of sex workers that we're talking about here. Elongated along Ocean Parkway, but how can you deny that those two facts alone, those are facts, are enough to make you conclude that there's a real good chance that they're all related, and therefore that there could be a similar or the same murderer or murderers. That's not a hard thing, to delve into, to draw that inference. So when I talk about the evidence, always evidence, you're also going to use in your own mind, as I did in mine, the proposition that inference can be drawn from evidence. Inference itself is not evidence. Speculation is not evidence. Right? Logic is not evidence. And logic depends upon certain assumptions, which could be faulty. So when you think about what I've just said, and you put it together, you say, wait a minute, how do we draw any conclusion from evidence? Well, you use inference, you use speculation, you use reason, you use all the other tools, but they're mere tools, and they're valuable tools, but they're not the decisive tools. The decisive tools are the evidence that bring you to the conclusion. And so when I stepped into that case in December, I recognized immediately that one of the great problems that the police department was having, and that caused the great controversy over the case, was that they were lacking proper evidence, and indeed they were ignoring proper evidence, and it appeared to be willful. It appeared to be deliberate purposes, that is. And they were instead making speeches and putting out information through the police commissioner, at that time a man named Dormer, and through their chief of police, that they were saying things that were absurd to explain their lack of evidence, when the evidence was there and they had just not used it. They had not acquired it, they had not used it, they had avoided it. And so I stepped in and said, wait a minute, this is the first problem. And as I've said in other encounters here with the public, when I came into the case, my job was very limited initially. It was not to discover the truth in all these 11 situations. It was not to become, Sherlock Holmes at all. I came into the case because Mary Gilbert, Shannan Gilbert's mom, had a connection with a reporter from the New York Daily News, Steve Barcelo. And Steve knew me. He had covered some of my other cases over the years that were public. And he was friendly with Mary because he grew up in Islip, and he knew all the players. He knew them personally, and he had personally investigated. Without the police, he had gone on his own and done a lot of investigation. And so when he covered another case, I did that Medford pharmacy case. You remember the murders? 5 of them. People were shot. So I was a lawyer for one of the victims' families. I spoke at the sentencing on that, and Barcelo said he was sitting in the jury box with the press covering the sentencing, and I spoke on behalf of the little girls. So he liked what I had to say, and because of that, he approached me and said, there's a lady who needs your help. And of course, it had been in the newspapers, I knew that. I had been following it more or less, not really in, with great detail, and it was varied. So we met in a bar in Iceland, a little bar, and I said I would help her. But my help was to be limited only to calling a press conference because the police had made such a mess of this case, especially of Shannan's case. And Shannan her remains had only been found about 8 days before I came into it. And they had botched it all. So Mary said, look, I don't want these people talking to me anymore. I don't want to deal with the police. Can you help me somehow? And I said, yeah, here's what we'll do. The strategy was, we'll call a press conference in Oak Beach. It was in January and late December. We'll call for the police to step down from the investigation and that the FBI step in, that the federal government step in. I said, I'll do the research, we'll prepare a big poster, I know how to do press conferences, and everybody knew that by then, and we'll cause some hay, and then that's it all I'm going to do for you. It was agreed, and that was it. No money, it was just going to be a favor. And so that's what we did. I wrote to the United States Attorney, and I asked that the FBI step in, and I pointed out that these are wetlands, so federal jurisdiction could apply because the bodies are found in wetlands. I also pointed out that Shannan Gilbert traveled from Jersey City, New Jersey on the night before she disappeared and went to, now it's getting better, isn't it? What happened?
Yeah.
I don't know.
The screen went black.
The screen went black. Anyway, and so I pointed that out, and it makes it easier, guys. I don't have to yell now. And said that that's bringing prostitution across state lines. That makes it a federal offense, and that would give them the right to step in. And that's correct. That's still correct. And so we held a press conference. It was kind of controversial when I did that, not least because some of the players from Oak Beach who were involved in the case themselves showed up at the press conference and got into a scuffle at the press conference. So it started off with craziness right away. And I made some say mistake, maybe. I did this, is what I did. I said that, there had been, the police had said that before they had even located Shannan's remains, and you remember they were looking for Shannan from the get-go, right? And now they had found her jeans and her pocketbook and her cell phone in a sort of a circle behind a fellow named Dr. Peter Hackett behind his house in the marsh. And when they did that, they hadn't located the bones yet. They said, Shannan Gilbert drowned. And without any evidence that she drowned whatsoever. When did you ever hear of that? Evidence, always evidence should be the police rule, and it was just the opposite. And from day one, I tell you that for this reason, to maybe frame out this meeting we're having tonight. From day one, the police marched forward on this case without evidence. And when you think about the homicide department in any jurisdiction, but especially here, we're the 5th largest suburban police force in the nation and the highest paid, that the homicide detectives are the elite. They're the creme de la creme of the police department. And it's their position, their job, their duty to solve murders and homicides. Knowing that, knowing their training and their dedication, and many of them, I know them. I've cross-examined many of them in 41 years of my practice. And I've had some 33 homicides in one way or another. Knowing that, can you disagree with me that the police, the homicide detectives, their whole purpose, their raison d'etre, is to gather enough evidence to convict somebody that they arrest of murder. That means they need to gather evidence beyond a reasonable doubt before they even present it to a grand jury. Because if they don't have that kind of evidence before they present it to a grand jury, they're going to be in trouble at trial. And then, if they're in trouble, a murderer walks free. So, it's their dedication, it should be, shouldn't it, to evidence. And here we are. And this will inform the entire process right up until today. Here we are with the police with a lack of evidence drawing a conclusion that Shannan Gilbert drowned without a scintilla of evidence that that was true. That theme continues to this day. And that's unfortunate. So, tonight you're hearing me step out a little and saying that this is still a problem. It's not solved because four indictments have been done as to this guy Heuermann. It's not. And there's already a signal flag being waved by a very good defensive lawyer, Michael Brown, who's the lawyer for Rex Heuermann, is a court-appointed lawyer. I've known Michael for many years since he started out as a young DA, and he was assigned to the East End Bureau, where they used to bury people when they, the district attorney didn't want to for any major things. They stuck him in the East End. Michael, that's where Michael started, and he tried his first felony case against me, and it got reduced to a misdemeanor. We went to trial, and he won in a domestic dispute case. So I saw him as a very good lawyer, and we became friends, and we stayed friends to this day, and Michael is still a friend through this case. And that flag was waved by Michael today, the flag I'm talking about. And what was that? That flag is this. For every person who has been identified as a suspect in the case, other than Heuermann, in any one of these cases that exist, what is being created is the possibility that the murderer is not Heuermann. And when the jury finally sits on this, it will be the duty of Michael Brown to make the jury believe that there are other possibilities besides Heuermann, and to cause reasonable doubt. And so it helps Michael in his case to have other theories about other murderers. And that would include the murderer or murderers of Shannan Gilbert. And Michael himself pretty much said so today at the press conference, if any of you saw it. I haven't seen it, I only heard about it, just because I'm too busy. But I will look at it. When Michael explained that he didn't think anybody would believe that Shannan Gilbert was not murdered, he was saying to the public, you say, well, it sounds like he's supporting John Ray then. Well, he is. And he's saying to the public, that's going to be his defense. The one I just laid out for you. Okay? And that's a good defense. It's not it's a good idea. I don't mean to say that if it's believed that justice would be served, that's a different question. But from a strictly a professional point of view, it's the right move by a defense lawyer. So taking you back, the police claim through their commissioner of drowning without a body, nor with any evidence that the girl entered any water. And when they find her bones just a few days later, she's laying face up with her head on a bush, and she's on kind of like a slight angle to the ground. And so later on in the case, when I got into it for a while, as you know, or you may know, I decided that with the police theory that Shannan Gilbert somehow panicked, was on drugs, and went into the marsh, panicked in the marsh, got lost, and died by drowning. I said, let's test that out. And I went and I walked with my assistant, who sits here now, and we walked at 4:53 a.m. In the first week of May of 2012 into the marsh to replicate what the police alleged that Shannan Gilbert had done. And we went and bought Vietnam-era fatigues that we wore, and shiny, iridescent boots and rope. Why? Because the way Dormer and others described the marsh behind the houses in Oak Beach, it sounded like, I was in some kind of primeval, I don't know, tundra or jungle or mix of both, and that there would be quicksand and wild animals and I'm not kidding. That's what they did. And indeed, when her jeans were found, a reporter had this good sense. In those days, the reporters at least still asked good questions. I'm not hearing any good questions today. Did you? At the press conference, I heard there were no good questions. But somebody asked a question of Dormer and said, "How did her jeans come off?" The jeans are laying about a quarter of a mile to a third of a mile away from the body. So how did that happen? And he said something along the lines that, I'm not quoting him, but I am imitating him a little bit. And he said, he's Irish. It came off from the sticker bushes, the bramble bushes. So she ran through the bushes in the marsh, and those bushes were so fierce and alive in early May that they reached out and pulled her pants off. That was a homicide theory. Can you believe that? That was expressed to the public. So of course, you see where I'm going. That's not evidence. It's the opposite of evidence. It's to exalt the absurd and expect people to believe it's reasonable because the police said so. And that's been the problem all throughout this case. Right? And so, of course, when they did find her, they had the opportunity to test the drowning theory. Because although her body lay on loam, which is kind of like a grassy element, and with her head on a bush, the water, it's damp there, of course. The water is about maybe that deep where she was, if there's water at all, it's underneath the loam. So to drown in that position, she would have had to roll over, suck the water into her lungs, then roll back and put her head down and die. All right? Well, it's absurd, isn't it? So they could have tested it anyway because their theory was, well, with hurricane, I don't know if it was hurricane, not Sandy, but like Sandy had alerted them to this. The marsh fills up with water sometimes, and maybe she drowned in the water and then it went away. The water went down. So they could have tested that theory, there's no evidence of it, by doing what's called a diatome test, which is a test that you can take of your hair or your bones. And she had a mat of hair left. There was even some skin left. And tested to see whether or not it had any water, and it would tell you that she did drown. They never did the test to this day. But yet, as late as this past summer, the police commissioner, my friend, but the police commissioner, speaking for the police department, said that he was adhering to the theory that Shannan Gilbert had drowned. If I make faces, would it be okay? And so they could have done a simple thing, they never did. And they had the bones and the skin and so on available to them for 3 years before I got hold of them and finally buried them. And to this day, they've never, exhumed them or anything to make this test. So, of course, you can see what it's evidence, always evidence. But here, lack of evidence, always lack of evidence, and then conclusion. And that's something seriously wrong when you consider that homicide detectives are just supposed to be the opposite of that in their whole approach to the case. After I called that press conference for several days later, I received a letter in the mail from Detective Vincent Steffen, who was the homicide detective in the case, one of them, and who was also I think either the vice president or treasurer of the detectives union, the PBA union. And he writes to me on detective stationery, not on police stationery. And he's a soldier. He's a real soldier of the DA's, of the Homicide Bureau, meaning that he follows the rules. He's the guy that doesn't step out of bounds. And here I get a letter that was completely out of bounds on stationery that had nothing to do, theoretically, with the police department. It was a 2-page, single-spaced letter, almost 2 pages, in which he details the evidence that he says exists to say that my press conference was all wrong, all wet. And how unprofessional my approach was compared to the police approach. And what a great job that the police did, and had all the cooperation of all these other police departments. And so, I don't know what I'm talking about, be quiet. That's pretty much what the letter said. But in that letter, he did something I've never seen done before or since in a homicide investigation. So you ask yourself, really? Shouldn't that alert you there's another flag on this case? And what was it that he did? He did exactly what the police say they will never do. They don't reveal evidence in an ongoing active criminal investigation. They keep tight lips about that unless they decide to release something like they did in this case with the initials on the belt around Maureen Brainerd Barnes' neck. But that's a choice that the police make, and it's deliberate for their own reasons. Here, you never just loosely release evidence. He discussed the evidence dealing with Shannan Gilbert, and he specifically said in the letter that everybody was calm on the 911 tape when Shannan made a 23-minute call to the 911 operator, in which she starts out by saying, "Someone is after me. Someone is after me." And then later on said, "They're trying to kill me." And she repeated that. That tape was not available to you, nor I, for years. And yet, Steffen wrote what he said was on that tape. And he said, nobody was upset. Everything was calm. Shannan was not excited. She was confused. And he said that the other people there were calm as well at all times. And that Shannan was never threatened. She was never under any threat. She was never in any danger in that letter to me. So you say to yourself, wait a minute. At first I thought, wow, this is cool. I'm getting a letter from a homicide detective arguing with me. I must have had some impact. Because why is he writing to me? Who am I? I didn't do anything. I'm not in this case. A few days later, that letter appeared in Newsday with 1 or 2 alterations in it, in a big black box, highlighted on their op-ed page. They sent it to Newsday in early January. So, in other words, it became the unofficial, official police dogma as to what really happened, how to look at this case. And they revealed evidence to the public as well as to me for that reason, to espouse their dogma. Think about that. Think about that when I know most of you sitting in this room have, since you're interested people, that's why you're here, you're taking off to come see me. Most of you have heard the tape. It's now public. I brought lawsuits, several lawsuits, to wrench the tapes out of the hands of the police, and I finally won. And then I won the appeals. There were two of them, and they tried to appeal it. They lost, and we finally got the tapes. I got the tapes years before you had them. But the irony was I got them, but the judge said you can't release them to anybody. You basically can't use them, but you're allowed to listen to them. And so I listened to what you have now listened to, and does anybody here say that letter, if you believe me, that's what the letter said. Does anybody here say that letter told the truth? If you do, raise your hand. No hands. Everybody knows that Shannan was in complete distress. Everybody knows that she was polite and rational. Everybody knows that there was a struggle on the tape. You could hear the wrestling in the room where she was, from where she was calling. Everybody knows that somebody grabbed her in the room, and that then there were voices in the background, and that then she, in exercising a Sophie's choice, decided to run. And I say exercising a Sophie's choice for a simple, obvious reason. She's in a room where she's telling the operator, someone is after me, they're trying to kill me. And she's in a room, in the room where she had been before, with the John. And she knows that if she goes outside, she's going to get caught and get killed. So she had Sophie's choice. Do I stay inside and wait for them to come and get me, or do I bolt? The irrational person would have stayed inside. The rational person did exactly what she did. She took the chance and bolted. And then you hear this blood-curdling screaming by her as she's confronted. Is that what Vincent Steffen's letter said? No, it is not. That what his letter said was a pack of outright lies. Deliberate lies. Now ask yourself, why is the police department lying to me and to the public when they published that letter? Years later, I had a meeting with the police commissioner, Rodney Harrison, who's a great guy, an honorable man, and who was searching for the truth here. And he came to my office right after he got sworn in. I was one of the first people he visited, contrary to the entire police department's approach up until then, when I was anathema. And he brought with him the chief of detectives. And I asked the chief of detectives when he was there, I said, well, how do you explain Vincent Steffen's letter? They were all untruths. He said, I know. And I said, well, how do you explain that? And he shook his head and said, I don't know. I just don't know. But there was never a repudiation of that man's letter by the police department when it was published. They never said, oh, it's just a private letter. So why did it come on Union Stationery? A mystery not solved yet. But 5 days or so later, after that letter appeared in my hands, the new chief of police was appointed, whose name was James Burke. James Burke, up until then, had been the chief of detectives for the district attorney's office. So you have to picture that law enforcement in Suffolk County is dual. There's the Suffolk County Police Department, and the normal police things they do. And the district attorney has his own separate little Praetorian guard of detectives who come from the police department but work for the DA. And so you really have sort of like two competing entities. And it's not I who is simply saying they're competing. If you remember back in the day, those of you who do, there was a competition and a verbal battle that took place on screen between the police commissioner and the district attorney about whether there was one killer or more than one killer. They were completely at odds with each other over that issue, publicly. So they did compete. And the head of the detectives bureau for the DA's office was James Burke. He was the de facto person in charge of the entire investigation before he became the chief of police. Don't doubt that for 1 minute. Tom Spoto was so powerful, he called the shots, and everybody did what he said. And he let Burke run the show. And Burke ran the show. So right from the outset, we have the influence of this totally morally degenerate man, completely personally corrupted and professionally corrupted, who should never have been there, controlling the entire investigation. What a surprise that we have these seemingly absurd self-contradictions right at the beginning of the case, which I have just described. That came about under that man's leadership, and I know that he had an enormous influence in the Union. He was an extremely powerful man, so powerful that to this day there are those who refuse to come forward and speak, and I know some of them. I've met them and talked to them privately because they're afraid of the power of Burke to this day. They may be wrong. He may no longer have any power, certainly after the Farmingville incident up here on Bald Hill in your neighborhood. One could wonder how he could have any power anymore. But I digress. Think about that. That much power, it was easy for him to tell the soldiers to write what he wanted in that letter and publish it and let it become the official, unofficial police rendition of what was false. That's what happened. Am I being too technical? I hope. If I'm not, if I am, tell me something else. I'll be glad to. But we still have some time, so I'm just giving you the flavor of where this whole thing went and where it's going. Okay? So, you now know the tapes, so you know the truth, at least as far as what the tapes purport to say. Let me jump around a little because it's kind of fun, maybe, instead of taking it chronologically, and it gives you a little more of a flavor for what I'm talking about. Right? And let me go to what the police said about the other evidence involving this case, not just with Shannan, but with others as well. The police department took the position that after it became obvious that Shannan Gilbert had not drowned, that was an absurd conclusion, then they said, in an official way, she died of unknown natural causes. And then that was explained by a variety of spokespeople for the police department as that, it was a cold morning, and she died from the elements. She panicked and just got lost, and she died from the elements. Could happen to any of us. We got lost in the dark. It was pitch black when she went into the marsh and got confused, took off her clothes because they got wet, and ran and just panicked and finally just laid down and died. That's what they said. That's what your police department said. And, you know, the thing that always amazed me, can I just digress like I do, as you notice now? Where was the press in questioning this? There was still some members of the press who said, wait a minute, something's wrong with this, and they started that. But nobody pushed, like you've seen back in the days of investigative reporting during the Vietnam era, and so on, right? Where reporters were real investigators. They sunk their teeth into a case and they went out and looked at it themselves. Only one reporter followed me into the marsh for 48 hours. And he's a great guy. And he's become a close friend of mine ever since. And that was it. Nobody else. But where I was going was that there was no evidence whatsoever that she died of natural causes. We looked up thank God for the internet nowadays, right? We looked up the weather for the day when she disappears, May 1st, 2010, and the weather was warm that day. And that morning, we looked up when the sun came up. Now, Shannan makes the call at 4:53 a.m. It's a 23-minute call. After the call ends and she appears to be running from a guy named Gus Coletti from his home after she had knocked on his door, you don't hear her. The machine goes off. We don't know why. Nobody knows why. It stops. But she doesn't appear at Barbara Brennan's house where she's finally seen knocking, trying to get into the house, pulling on the door to get in, and desperately trying to escape from somewhere. And then you don't see her again. That phone call, I forget exactly the time, but it takes place in like 6:20 or somewhere in that neighborhood. And then to go from Barbara Brennan's house, which was up on the bay, on the water, and then get to the marsh, it would take, you'd have to walk. It's a decent enough walk to get there. By the time she would have entered there for the marsh, in the best of all circumstances, for the police version, it would have been around 6:30, maybe a little later, whatever, but in that neighborhood. The sun came up at about, did I say 6:30? I meant 5:30. Sorry, 5:30. The sun came up, I think, at 5:42, thereabout. Twilight comes before sunlight. When we went into the marsh at the same time, and we went in earlier, it was not dark. It wasn't light, but it wasn't dark. And by the time we got a little bit into the marsh, by 5:45, it was already light out. It was starting to become light. And then to walk all the way across the marsh through the sticker bushes and the reeds and the loam, it took a little work to get to where Shannan was found. In other words, it wasn't dark. She couldn't have been that lost. It was light enough, and light enough that you could see, depending upon the rise of the ground, you could see into the houses along the road that Hackett's house was on. You could see into the windows at the end. You could see people sitting there having their morning coffee. That was as you looked south. If you looked north, you couldn't see it, but you could hear the cars going, on Ocean Parkway. I guess people were going to work.
Hold the midsection of the microphone.
The midsection?
Yeah.
Here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Ah, okay. Thank you. I didn't know that. I was spinning it around. Thanks, Nani. Appreciate it. This is my staff, by the way, my loyal staff here. So I should have introduced them. I'm sorry. They're very good at what they do. Great researchers. Anyway, so now I forgot where I was. Nani, tell me where I was.
You could see the houses in Oak Beach from the marsh.
Right, and you could hear the cars on the other side. So for somebody to panic and knowing that, you'd have to imagine that she was completely gone. But you heard the tape. She was not completely gone. And now we're later on, when whatever substance they claim she took, of which they have not a scintilla of evidence, would have started to wear off. Just the opposite of what they're talking about. the evidence didn't support the conclusions at all. Why would the homicide people accept that? Something's wrong here. And so they said, well, she couldn't get through. It's true, there were sticker bushes that you couldn't get through when you get to the edge of the roadway. But is that when you say, I can't get another 30 feet out, I'll just lay down and die? Okay? Does that sound right? Look, just nonsense. It's just nonsense. And we also noticed that there were mosquito canals that were about maybe up to the top of your boot. Some of them might have been a little deeper, but they had boards open in all different places because plenty of people go back there and walk around, and hunters hunt in the back, and kids go and play. And we found bows and arrow things from in the right behind Hackett's house in the woods. We found balls, things like that. So plenty of people used the marsh. It wasn't completely, and our whole costume became kind of a joke amongst us. We're carrying ropes in case we needed to be pulled out of the quicksand. And none of that mattered. We didn't need any of that. So it was kind of interesting. But you can see the evidence just is absurd for any of those things. They then changed that. The police department then changed that. Why? Because I kept picking at it in places like this, saying this is just ridiculous. So what did they then come up with as the next theory? The next theory was she died of an unfortunate, that was their word, tragic, that was another one of their words, accident, which was their word. An unfortunate, tragic accident. That's what they said on May 13th, 2022, when they held the press conference to tell the press, this case is over, leave it alone, it's gone. And they went to Suffolk County Community College in Brentwood, to the big auditorium there, and called the press in, and they put up a big screen and showed videos to support their theory and espoused what I just told you. And it went on for about 20 minutes because this was the day they chose to play the tape for the public. So I went to the meeting, to the press conference, and I was refused entrance, as was anybody who was not a member of the press. So we had to watch it on a little screen that Senator Boyle brought with him, a friend of mine, Phil Boyle, and he was standing there, and we together watched his phone as we watched the press conference go on. But what was fascinating about that press conference was that it was conducted by the chief of detectives, the same guy who sat in my office that I told you about, and he did all the speaking. Rodney was there, but he just let the detective conduct the whole thing. And out came a reporter to me early, before the conference ended. And he comes out, and he's in a very bad way, and he said, John, this is completely ridiculous. This is a fake, and they're putting up fake evidence. Now, this is a dyed-in-the-wool reporter from a major network. And I said, well, tell me what you mean. He said, look at he said, I know, he's a cameraman as well, right? And he said, I know cameras. He said, what they're doing is they show the marsh that Shannan went into because she was in this confused state of mind and she would, in the darkness got lost. And they show the reeds, and you see the white reeds, and you see all darkness behind him. And he said, that's a fake slide. He said, what you do is you close the aperture. I'm not sure what all that means. I'm not a cameraman. But you close it down, and it causes the contrast to be enhanced so that you see light and dark. And it looks very forbidding. That did not exist. They made that up. That's true. And he was upset about it. And they played excerpts of the tape for the reporters. They corralled all the major reporters, all the major stations into this auditorium and said, listen to the tapes yourselves now. And you can tell that Shannan is confused. You can tell that She might be on something, and you can tell that from her speech she's slurring it, and basically this all supports their theory. And they played the parts of the tape. They eliminated big chunks of the tape, the 23-minute tape. The reporters only heard about 3 or 4 minutes with the show, the slideshow. Meanwhile, on the police website, or whatever they call it, I think it was their website, they played the full tape. But the reporters weren't listening to that. They were listening to what I just said. And that's what they reported dutifully. And they never heard the whole tape for their reports. And so it goes. And it went away. After that, have you heard anything about Shannan Gilbert? No, not much. Except what I said, that the commissioner himself announced that she drowned. They went back to the theory for the last time and said she drowned. And none of that makes any sense whatsoever. So that's just a taste of the rest of the investigation that went on since then. And even if you believe, and I do believe, that many of the detectives doing the work, they were not misled. They were honest people who tried to do well. And I have for them very great regard. I'm not an anti-cop guy, that's out here, pushing some kind of agenda. Because I've cross-examined these detectives, as I've said, many of them are now retired, many of them, but they were brave men who fought against terrible criminals and took risks that you can't believe, and I've listened to them testify to it on the witness stand, and you can have nothing but the greatest regard for them, for their courage and their integrity. And a lot of them they were part of the police investigation. But their voices weren't heard here. And, they weren't the ones who came forward with what I'm talking about. So, I throw that element in there so I'm not just using this to try to razzle-dazzle you into disliking the police. It's just not my purpose. My purpose is to say, why are they doing this? Why in God's name are they doing this when they never do things like this? This just isn't their way. So, moving on to other facts that might make you wonder about all of this. If you ask for evidence that the police would have to support what they showed, you will find none. They will say, well, it's an open and active case. But they won't show you the evidence. For example, the evidence that Shannan was on drugs. You know why? There is no evidence that Shannan was on drugs. Zero. And when the toxicology report came from the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, who conducted the toxicological tests, there was no evidence of any drugs in her system. Now, it's true that if she took drugs that morning, it wouldn't have made it into her hair or her skin necessarily. It might take days for that to happen. So it's the fact that there were no drugs in her system, according to the testing, really isn't dispositive of whether or not she took drugs. But there's no evidence that she did. Simple as that. And there's no evidence that she was a drug addict. Zero. And I did my own little investigation on that, and we checked with the different hospitals in New Jersey where she originally worked as a sex worker, and none of them had any records of Shannan ever being entered in there for drug addiction of any kind. And she lived in Jersey City, so you know. So that's out. You can't say there's evidence when there isn't any. It just doesn't work that way. And when you listen to, as I said, I'm repeating myself now for emphasis, but you listen to the tape, is she really, do you find her to be stoned out of her mind? I don't. And I know her family. I've represented other members of her family, as some of you may know, and in tragedy as well. And Sarah's voice, her sister Sarah, and her sister Cherie, to a lesser degree, but still sound like Shannan's voice that you hear on the tape. They speak the same way. They have that same slurry voice. It's just a trait. And so that's just an observation. And maybe sometimes you need to separate observation from evidence, from inference and so on, but it's an observation I mean. I don't see anything at all that says that Shannan was loony. In fact, she even says to Michael Pack on the tape, you're part of this, aren't you? She explains that, what her thinking is. So why are we ignoring all that kind of evidence? Let me interject that, and I'm going to put up the little poster for you later. I'm holding a symposium, I'm calling it, where I'm going to take the kind of evidence I'm talking to you tonight about, and there's a lot more than what I'm saying to you, and I'm going to present it to the public at St. John's University in Queens on January the 30th. It's free admission. I've rented the hall, and we've got security. We've rented security, electronics, and we're doing it through a nonprofit corporation that I had started some years ago called the Magdalene Dismas Society, and it's for legal services. And they are going to present what we say is all the evidence that I've garnered over the years, not only for Shannan, but for all the other cases as well. And I'm also going to present new evidence nobody's heard before, and I'm going to present witnesses, also witnesses to the depraved behavior of Rex Heuermann and his wife. We're going to put it out there, and you can make your own decisions. So you're welcome to come to that and really hear more, a lot more than what I've already explained to you. I'm sure it'll be a little controversial, to say the least, and so it's worth it. If you can't make it, we'll be streaming it, and so you can pick it up that way as well. But if you come, it would be valuable, and I believe a lot of the press will be coming, from what I'm told. So that's the way I'm approaching it. We use the Magdalene Dismas Society because I formed that society several years ago to help people who are, well, like I've said, buried alive in their lives by authority, the government, or even by institutions of society, where they just don't stand a chance. No matter what they've done in their lives, they just don't stand a chance. And over the years, I've helped those people. And so I thought, well, let's try to do it through a formal organization and attract maybe some help in that respect. So that's why we have it. And it's named after Mary Magdalene, who was historically reputed to have been a prostitute, and yet reformed and stood at the foot of Christ's cross and had the privilege of being the first one to visit his empty tomb on Easter Sunday and to greet the angel. So that's a documented story. And Dismas was the good thief who, you remember, Christ was crucified with two thieves, on two people on either side. And he was the good thief because he said, remember me when you get there. And Christ said, you're the first one into heaven. And so a thief and a prostitute, pretty unlikely heroes, right? And if that can be, we can help people who are crushed, who are buried alive by things they can't control anymore. That's what happened to these sex workers. In this case, I got to know many of their backgrounds, many of their personalities, their history, And I can tell you without any doubt that maybe they made some bad choices. We all do. Worse maybe than anyone you ever made, maybe not. But there were forces around them that crushed them before they stood a chance. And think of it this way. I know I can talk about, I won't tonight, but I can talk about the terrible upbringing of some of these people. One thing I noticed that was common to all of them, the girls that were murdered, and some of the girls I've met who were not murdered, who are still alive, but have suffered terribly because they were sex workers. One of the things I noticed was that in every case, they skipped over their childhood. You grew up, I grew up, we had a childhood. Maybe it was great, maybe it wasn't, but we had a childhood. And we merged with adulthood over the course of time. They didn't. Many of them were, most of them even, were abused sexually when they were 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. Sarah Gilbert, who lost her mind. Sarah Gilbert was abused day after day after day, year in and year out, having to give oral sex to a man. She didn't have a childhood. Didn't exist. So, if you're crushed by that, what a surprise that she ended up as she did, right? It's those people I'm trying to help. And those are the people I'm working for. Now, you can't help them anymore on earth because they're dead. But they also have souls, every one of them. If you don't believe that, then why do you care about murder? If only the body matters. There's no big deal, is it? We're all going to die, so what's the difference how? If you only believe in the body, material things. But if you know that we all have a soul, those souls are still alive. They're alive forever. And the problem they have, every one of them, those sex workers, and the little baby, and the cross-dressing male who's dead, the problem they have is that it's not that they lack for justice. Everybody says, well, we want justice. We want justice for them. That's what we want. Really? Do you really want justice for yourself? If you ask for justice for yourself, I think you'd be a pretty scared individual for all the things we've done wrong in our respective lives. Do you really want justice? Justice is a hard, cruel thing. I met Justice many times in my practice, right? I've met her. She is whole, and she is cold, hard granite, unsmiling, bitter. Do you really want justice? Or is it mercy that you really want? Don't we all want mercy? That will work to offset the true imposition of justice. And that's what these girls need. They need mercy. See? How did they get mercy for what they put themselves through? How do they get that? They get that by seeking, by the earthly, us seeking the truth, not seeking justice. That's not for us to do. That comes from somewhere else. But seeking the truth, we have that ability. And if we give them the truth, I suspect, in the course of things celestial, the truth, we've heard it said, will set you free. The truth will set them free and give them the mercy of God. And that's what we look for each one of them. That's what I look for. So, if you ever wondered, what's this guy doing, running around, I'm in my 13th year of doing this. I put in probably, we estimate between 30 and 50,000 hours of work on this case. I've invested a lifetime of money. I've probably out of pocket put out about $50,000. You know, and it's taken a real dent in my practice, in my personal life. And people say, "Wow, you know, we've heard it said again and again from people who are on Reddit. You know, the quarterbacks that sit there and type. You know, they work really hard. Type. Well, he just wants the publicity. He's out there, you know, standing in front of the cameras. That's what this is all about." Well, that's just not true. And if that were true, what a fool, right? To seek publicity at that expense, some 30 to 50,000 hours for a few, you know, minutes of Andy Warhol would say 15 seconds of fame. You know, that's ridiculous. I'm trying to think of the poet who said, "Fame is the food that dead men eat." And so, it's not that, but I will tell you that I am one to say we need publicity on these cases, in this case in particular. We need publicity, and publicity I do seek. And why? Because you want to know. You're the public. That's what publicity is about. You need to know, and I need the publicity to generate your interest and to generate your evidence that you can give me and your help. And it's never been more true than today to do that, where everyone is completely devoted to watching visuals on the media. So publicity becomes extremely important to generate evidence, and it has done so in many of my well-known cases. It's generated huge numbers of witnesses and evidence that otherwise would have stayed buried, but for the publicity, and has made all the difference in the world. And it has in this case as well. And you'll find that if you come to the symposium when I talk about some of the new evidence that's come forward and people who have come forward. It's extremely important to generate that kind of evidence. I don't know how the police feel about that. Some think it's a good idea, others don't. I know what I think, and I know how it's worked in my career, is to get that kind of evidence to come forward. So that's why we do that. That's why we push for publicity. And I'll stand by that. Okay. Now, back to one other point on Shannan, and I'll move on. And that is that nobody knows when Shannan Gilbert died. So when the police say, well, she died of an unfortunate accident, when they don't identify the accident, because there's no evidence of it whatsoever, when they don't identify any cause of nature that's possible to have killed her, if you consider all of that, then what's left? What's left? What's left is conclusions that they don't want to draw, that she was murdered. And there's a plethora of other evidence that this is true. But when I say that to you, you might wonder, what about the others as well? What about the evidence for the other victims in this case? Is it similarly situated? Or, have things happened that the police either have ignored or are unaware of, or have another reason, a darker reason to have ignored it, that evidence? And there's some evidence that that's true. When 13 years go by and cases remain unsolved because witnesses weren't contacted, they weren't looked at, you can be sure that 13 years later, that evidence has weakened, has dissipated, has disappeared, has died, has moved away, in the form of witnesses and in the form of physical evidence. And so the longer that it takes to solve these cases, the less likely they ever will be. And there's no better evidence of that than I've taken the testimony again as late as recently as October 18th. I took the testimony of Joe Brewer for John for Shannan Gilbert. It was the second time I took his testimony. Actually, fourth time, because he kept breaking up the interviews. But he was able to say over and over again, when I'd ask him a question, he'd say, "I don't remember that. It was 13 years ago. What do I know?" And he'd make a big long speech about what he didn't know because it was too long ago. And how am I going to break through that? He's going to hide behind that. The driver, I took his testimony back in the spring. Again, I'd taken it before, I took it again, Michael Pack. And he did the same thing. I don't remember that, 13 years ago. Almost 12 years ago, 13 years ago. I just don't remember anymore. And so the guilty can hide behind lack of memory and get away with it because it's too old. What do you do with that? What do you do with that with all the other cases? How are you going to solve those? And unless you find physical evidence like they did with Heuermann, with the fairly desiccated hairs that were found, how are you going to solve any case? You know, now we know today for the first time, allow me to ramble a little bit here, but we know that the hair samples degenerated somewhat that were used to test the DNA. They're not in the same condition they would have been if they had been used or found years ago. So, you know, it's hard to know exactly what really happened, even through the evidence that they found about Heuermann. And that takes it to another level, I know, but think about it. I mean, the evidence they're talking about that they use a certain kind of mitochondrial, they call it, DNA testing, which only puts you in a group of people who might be likely to have committed the murder. It doesn't mean you did. And that's the kind of evidence the police now have because everything is deteriorated. That's gonna, if you get the right jury, if you're the defense, you only need to turn one person's mind and it becomes a hung jury. It's an issue. It's a real issue in this case. What about the others who are besides the four? The other, the rest of them. There's 7 others, counting Shannan. How are we going to solve those cases where there's no known physical evidence to tie them to anybody at this point? How are they going to get solved? It seems harder and harder the longer it takes. And I point that out to you because as I started to draw the circle I did when I started this lecture, over the years, the police have repeatedly ignored witnesses from whom they could have drawn testimony that would have made their efforts more poignant. But they didn't do this when they should have. And that's not the fault of the task force that exists now. I don't want you to think I'm hammering them. I'm hoping that, we've got a clean slate of good detectives that are working on this. But it is to hammer those who came before, because they've left this is their heritage. This is what they've left. That there's nobody around anymore who can, unless somebody steps forward, and even then it's questionable, right? Who can say, a person who can say, yeah, I did it, or it was done by this person or that, and I saw it, and so forth. It's all gone away. I know in the Shannan's case, there are several witnesses in Oak Beach who were part of the concatenation of lies and half-truths and cover-ups who the police did not even interview. You maybe have prying into too many particulars, but you may remember that Michael Pack's story was that He drove looking for Shannan, couldn't find her, and then he left Oak Beach, going out the main gate, and he went to another appointment to pick up money from another driver like he, and then use that, and then deposit that money in a bank vault or something, a big, one of these ATM type things, on Horace Harding Boulevard in Queens, and that's where he went. And he said the police accepted that story. That's the story they told him, and the police corroborated that story. They checked it out. So it all checked out. Michael Pack was telling the truth. Really? Well, I checked it out, and we found the other guy. There was another guy who was a driver and had been up in Connecticut driving a girl who he claimed jumped out of his car and ran on a bridge on his way into New York. And he was meeting up with Michael to give Michael the money that Michael talked about. But much later in the day. And they did meet. He did give Michael the money, if you believe him. And he spoke to me at length. So I was able to kind of test his credibilities. But one of the things he said that I thought was critical. The police never called him. I found him like that, with my good Steph. Police didn't find him and never talked to him. So when they said, and they did say, that they corroborated Pack's story, that was not true. Simple as that. That's just one. There were plenty of others who were not interviewed at all or who were barely interviewed. Peter Hackett, Dr. Peter Hackett, was interviewed once. He was brought by the detectives to Yaphank to be interviewed. He's the former police surgeon of Suffolk County and the former head of emergency medical services in Suffolk County. And he was brought to headquarters where they said, well, you'll take a lie detector test. He called his lawyer, and the lawyer said, don't do it. He refused. He lawyered up, and that was the end of it. And nobody bothered Peter Hackett again. Incredible. Incredible. Justin Canning was a young man whose father lived across the street from Barbara Brennan, the woman whose door Shannan knocked on that morning. And she called Canning, who lived across the street, and said, come over here. I've got this girl knocking on my door. When he went over, depending on whether you believe his story or his son's story or his wife's story, each one which is different in substantive ways. When he went over, he claimed he went with his dog, and then when he saw nobody, he went back home, dropped off his dog, and came back to Mrs. Brennan's house. But his son, Justin, who was a heroin addict, and the closest friend of Peter Hackett's son, and the guy who lived next door, Sal Aversano's son, who died of a heroin overdose, when he talked about this matter, he went with his father, and they saw Shannan Gilbert. And he said so, and the New York Post reported it. And the New York Post had a reporter doing that work who's been a reporter, he's now dead, but he was a real solid gold reporter. He wouldn't make up a story like that. Justin Canning claimed under oath to me that he called the Post and said, you people are making a false story. That I never said that I saw Shannan. And I want you to retract it. And then the Post said they would and never did. And he said, okay, he didn't do anything about it. That was his testimony. When I asked his father about his son's story, he said, my son's a liar. The police never interviewed Justin Canning, which was my point. all right? The last one to say he had seen Shannan Gilbert to the public, say it to the public. They never interviewed him. And he got busted in New Jersey in a big heroin deal, and the police knew about it, and they never went to interview him, and they had him trapped in the jail. And as you know, if you know cop work at all, they do what you call roll them up. They go to the witness and they tell him, look, kid, you're going away for a long time, and we're going to make sure of that, and so on. Talk to us, and maybe we can help you out. They never did that with Justin Canning, an essential witness. So I just mentioned some of these things randomly, but very similar things happen with other people as well. And maybe now the police are trying to make up for lost time. I hope so in these cases, but who knows? We know that in other cases the police just didn't interview the witnesses. They just didn't. They left it. So the whole investigation of Oak Beach and Gilgo Beach, in other words, is informed, isn't it, by a failure to investigate. That's the bottom line here. And then, nonetheless, trying to draw inferences and conclusions without the necessary evidence that would have come from a proper investigation. Can the police make up for lost time? You and I have to say we doubt it. Maybe, be nice, but we have to doubt it because time has passed. And like Jack the Ripper, the case at the turn of the century, 2 centuries ago now, getting old, right? 2 centuries ago, at the turn of that century, there were all kinds of theories about who was Jack the Ripper in London. And those theories, some of the older folk here grew up with knowledge of those things because they were popular still. There were all different theories about who was Jack the Ripper. And there were all books written about it and movies made. And to this day, I don't know that anybody knows for sure who was Jack the Ripper, although there's a lot of really good evidence going this way or that. And that happened because of the failure of police work dealing with prostitution. And the same thing here. If we do catch the murderers, or if we even know who they really are, if we can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, but we know who they are from all the other evidence, and they actually say they convict somebody of all those killings, do you think the public will still believe that that person was the only killer? Or that person was the killer of each one of them? If it was, say, for example, Rex Heuermann who killed them all, would anybody really believe that? Or will it be like the bullet that, how many bullets entered Kennedy's body kind of story? Nobody to this day agrees with what really happened because of all the mistakes made in the investigation. I suggest to you that's what's going to happen here. The police can do the greatest job in the world now and solve all of these challenges, and still there'll be plenty of us who don't believe it. Why? Because the evidence disappeared. So there'll be all kinds of theories that supplant the evidence, and nobody will really know for sure, or they just won't believe it. In other words, the real heritage, the real legacy of that era of police work is this unfortunate confusion that will last forever. And then I ask, will you be able to do that mercy, that act of mercy for those women and the little baby? I don't know. It's a hard call. Still, I have hope. Searching for the truth is really what we should be about, all of us. And I have the tools as a lawyer that other people don't have. I have the right to subpoena, I have the right to examine, I have a right to investigate. and some ability to do so. But time is getting late, and they can outweight me, can't they? And I hope that doesn't happen. I hope we can get to a point where we make some serious progress and get to where we need to go. But I guess the best thing is to pray for that, and then hope the work works. Well, that's my view of the whole thing. You know, there's so much more, and I managed to do that in less than 2 hours so far. And I know you have more time with me. I've agreed to that. So I'm just saying that, to sum it up, I won't give up. And there's all new developments we heard about today, and some of them are not so good. I'm concerned that whether a grand jury will continue to sit on this case and continue to investigate, or whether, now that they think they solved the 4, that they tend to rest contented in possession, like the dragon fanfare, and not move on with things and try harder. It's easy to be content with what we have. Will that happen? I hope not, but I worry. I don't know. I digressed again, didn't I? But I will keep at it. I won't give up. My staff won't give up. They spend many, many hours, these 3 young people, after hours working in the office. It's coming in on weekends and relentlessly pursuing this case. And we won't give up. We won't give up. I don't care what happens. We're not giving up. I think you'll see that in the next few months. There'll be some serious attacks made upon my credibility, my work. It'll happen. I see it coming. It's okay. Can deal with it. No, to a point. I'm Irish, so I go out on Friday night. I'll have a tip. It'll be fun. But seriously though, yeah, we're not giving up. We're going to keep going. That's the key to everything. So let me finish on that. Don't give up. We don't give up. I teach our daughter, don't give up. And I'm asking you not to as well. And so I'm not done, because now I'm opening the floor to your questions, which I probably should have done a little earlier, but I rambled. So forgive me. Questions? Issues? Madam?
I got a question. Oh, 2 actually. We talk about latest evidence, but I'm hearing tell that Heuermann, his wife could somehow be. Is that something in the mix there?
Well, that's a very controversial issue. And
it's not. But
yeah, it is, because in August, maybe it was early September, I forget which, but around that time, she got a lawyer, 2 lawyers actually, for herself and her children. And the lawyers held a press conference. They didn't even go to it. And the lawyers asked for money because she was so poverty-stricken from the assault on her house by the police. And they said, well, please give us money. They said that on a day when they had already raised in their GoFundMe over $44,500. It was already in the kitty when they had that obnoxious press conference. And I had information from new people who had come forward to me because they didn't trust the police, so they called me. And they were credible people. And I had information that told me that she should not be out there raising any money, that she should be a suspect in this case. So I held a counter press conference just a mile away from where they were. The press came over, some of them, and I made that statement. And I said, I have backup for that. And of course, the big thing became, John Ray doesn't have any backup. He's making that up. He's just looking for publicity. He invented that. Well, I didn't. And eventually, you heard Rodney Harrison, the commissioner, stand next to me at my press conference at my office and say, that's credible evidence. And if you don't want to talk to the police, call John Ray. He said that. So I stood by it, and I still stand by it. And I do not think for one New York second that that woman should be put outside the realm of suspicion. Her hairs are found on 3 of the bodies, plus on the belt, or counting the belt. Okay? The district attorney today was emphatic in saying, from what I heard, she has an alibi. She was, for Maureen Brandon Barnes, she was at Atlantic City with her children for a very long stay. Kind of odd, I thought, for bringing children. But, and they had the tickets to prove it. And then the husband came 8 days later or something like that, and they went to another hotel and stayed in Atlantic City. So she has a rock-solid alibi. Excuse me, but the hairs are the hairs are the hairs, number one. And number two, just watch the way this woman behaved. It's completely antithetical to innocence, the way she's behaved since then. All right, that's inference. That's not necessarily evidence. So I'll allow that for that. However, the hairs are evidence. The testimony of the people I have is evidence. And you can use your reason to say, wait a minute, this is a 1,343 square foot house. That's a superannuated bungalow. And for 27 years, she had no idea what was going on in the basement or elsewhere. You know, the states where they traveled. And well, you know, she's just a, beaten down, sad woman who's a victim just like the other victims who are dead of this terrible man. Do you hear victimhood in traveling to Atlantic City and staying there for 15 days with your family? Does that sound like abused woman to you? She's traveled many other places, conventions, con conventions where she dresses up in weird creature outfits and so forth. And this is somebody who shouldn't be in the realm of suspicion. She needs to be in that circle of suspicion. I can say that. You know, she's made herself a public figure. She's now making a 7-figure amount of money to say what she's got to say, to show up like she did today from a Peacock, a major network. Over $1 million. So, you know, should she be in the circle of suspicion? I would say so. And the fact that she has this alibi, she was in New Jersey, if she was there all the time. That's not too far from Long Island. All right, number one. And number two, what's missed in all of this, there's several things missed, so I'll address it. I know it's taking a little time to answer your question. But think of this. Nobody knows when those girls died. One thing that does seem to be true is that Heuermann was deeply involved in torture. He loved torture, from all the evidence we have. Did he take them and lock them up in, for example, the storage units that he had and keep them there? Those storage units were very large enough to contain another storage unit within the unit. Could he have kept them there? Could he have kept them elsewhere? Is that part of torture? Remember when Shannan Gilbert, by the way, just off the topic, when Shannan Gilbert, she came from Jersey City, when Peter Hackett made the second call that he lied about, said he never made, he made it from a New Jersey location where the phone pinged off a tower in Hasbrook, New Jersey on that Thursday. Was Shannan Gilbert still alive as of that Thursday? He was in New Jersey. He denied that he was there, and I confronted him with the phone evidence, and he couldn't explain it. Were these girls tortured and kept for a while? In which event the alibi isn't such an alibi? And another question I asked that doesn't seem to be addressed is, when were they buried? The 4 girls. Were they all buried at once? Were they buried at different times? Were they buried where their bodies were kept for, say, 6 months and then dumped there? all of that time, did she help in assisting to get rid of the bodies? There's no evidence of that, one way or the other. None. So it's not true to say that the alibi is solid, rock gold, that's it, end of story. She just didn't know. It's complete nonsense to me. And the evidence we have of Heuermann chasing other victims, you mean to say all this chasing around from state to state, place to place, never got noticed? And then I raise the last point on that, and then I'll move on to the next question. And that is this. Did you hear the district attorney or her lawyers say that when she said he's telling the truth, her husband is not guilty? Did you hear her address something that would put you in jail, even if you didn't do any killings, would put you in jail for 20 years? And that is the dark web porn and the child porn. Really vicious child porn. None of them have denied that. That goes on over the course of time in his house, in his computer, in his 1,343 square foot house, where not only did Heuermann live, his wife and his 2 adult children, or one is a stepchild, but also his brother lived, and another person lived, another woman lived, according to the records I have found through my wonderful staff. All crammed in there. But nobody noticed that this guy was getting off on sick, deep porn that would put him in jail for 20 years if he were found guilty. Why isn't that addressed? And if she knew about that, then why wouldn't you believe that she knew about other things as well? How come that's not addressed? I just thought I'd bring it up. Other questions? Yeah.
What do you think happened to Shannan Gilbert, and why do you think the Suffolk Police Department didn't want the FBI's help and handled it the way they did?
Shannan Gilbert was murdered. The evidence is overwhelming that she was murdered. Her hyoid bone alone is cracked. When I strangle you as a woman, we have studies that go all the way back to the 19th century. 90-some-odd% of the women who are strangled, their hyoid bone breaks. Her hyoid bone was fractured, according to Dr. Michael Baden, a friend of mine who I brought in, world-renowned, the most renowned medical examiner in the world. He and I was with him and his brother Bobby and a reporter when we got the bones and we did the autopsy, and we could see the broken hyoid bone. And there was a hole, either punched or drilled right through the center of that bone. Hole about 3/16 of an inch. She was murdered. And what was the second part of your question?
Well, why did the Suffolk Police Department not want the FBI's help, and why did they handle it? What are they hiding?
I believe that the answer to your question lies in a closer examination of the influence of Burke and others in that early investigation. It was Burke who, even Geraldine Hart said, drove away. Geraldine was the next commissioner. And she said that the FBI was driven away. She was an FBI agent originally by Burke. And that makes a lot of sense in light of what I've told you already. It fits quite well in light of what I told you. But he didn't completely reject the FBI, because he couldn't. They did do some things. One thing they did do was that they loaned a helicopter that flew over the marsh to locate with infrared lighting anybody, and they saw none. They did not see Shannan Gilbert. That they did, and they did a profile. Profiling is the weakest kind of evidence there is, but they did profiling as well. That was it. So the FBI took a passive role because they were told to. And to this day, right now, the FBI does not go around knocking on doors and interviewing witnesses. They're doing all the lab work and that sort of thing. Okay? Other questions? Yeah.
I watched something, I can't remember the whole thing, but they were looking, I think the Gilgo killer, and they found people like in Atlantic City. They wound up in a man's house in Massapequa in the basement. I'm just wondering if that's the same guy. Is there a guy in his basement, all kinds of videos and porn, and was not able, or wasn't gonna be him. And they just disappeared, the whole. Because they can't prove it, or whatever. Nothing, I never heard anything else.
I'm not sure what you're talking about, honestly.
There was some kind of documentary, they were going to Atlantic City, they were checking the sex worker was being killed. And I think they were trying to tie those together.
Oh, that was Zeman's piece, what's it called?
Killing season.
The Killing Season, thank you.
Yeah, and they wound up, right, some guy, they said in a basement in Massapequa, but it couldn't be him, some crazy nonsense.
The Killing Season went from a really good piece of work to complete silliness. And they ended up saying that it was truck drivers who were doing the killing across the nation.
Oh, yeah.
It just, the man, I have no idea what was wrong with that guy, why, you know, but.
In someone's basement with crazy kind of videos saying he couldn't do it, couldn't possibly.
I don't know, I mean,
The other question is.
I couldn't answer you, I'm sorry.
Massapequa was a pretty upscale-ish neighborhood.
Depending where.
Yeah, but his house kind of stuck out. And he was this big office.
Well, he's in Massapequa Park, they're different, first of all. It's much more of a middle.
Like that, people were like, "You guys architects own businesses?"
Well, how would you get the bodies in and out of there if that's where they were killed easily without anybody noticing? The neighbor's yards are right up against his yard, and he has a tiny little yard and a tiny little house, and he killed that many people and took. I mean, something's wrong with that picture as well. I strongly believe that they were killed elsewhere, but I can't be sure. You know, how else do you dispose of bodies? They're not easy. Listen, you know, even if you kill, they were all these little girls, right? They were tiny little girls. Even if you try lifting dead weight, literal dead weight, 90 pounds. Even if he is, it's still one heck of a drag, isn't it? The carry? You don't put them into your arm and just walk out like it's wood, you know? And yeah, but it's still noticeable is my point. That's my point. And it's not easy. So, you know, I don't know what happened. I do know in that house from the witnesses we have is that he had frequent sex workers there, sometimes more than one, and his wife was literally aware of it at all times. So, I mean, what's going on here? And there's this swinger situation that we know about from the witness who called me that he was involved in swinging. And why does any of that seem unlikely when you consider the absolute fact that he had this dark porn and it was involving torture and torture of children? Okay? So think of it that way. Then I think that answers a lot of questions. But other questions? We still have 10 minutes. Sir?
Just wondering if you've heard of the thing with his cousin, the Reverend, that supposedly.
We found that 3 months ago? We had that information for the last 3 months. And yes, we did find his name is Christopher or
Kenneth.
Kenneth, yeah,
he's
Kenneth Heuermann.
The priest, right? It was like the
He was a Lutheran pastor, and Heuermann's family is involved in, were involved, the broader family, in active in the Catholic Church. But with the ecumenical movement, it doesn't surprise me that there's a Lutheran and a Catholic involved in the same thing. They're cousins. So the chances that they knew each other, he lived in Merrick or Belmore, and this other guy, Kenneth, and Heuermann lived in Massapequa Park, both on the South Shore, a short drive from each other. The chances are overwhelmingly likely that they knew each other, and possibly that leads to other things. We don't know what it leads to, but it's a step in that direction.
That's kind of what I just.
Yeah, yeah. And that guy was into all kinds of child porn
Yeah,
and child abuse. as well. So, you know, you have that. But Heuermann's family was prominent in Nassau County. So that's another reason why the house makes no sense. His uncle, I think his name was George. His uncle was the chief assistant to Francis Looney, who was the police commissioner of Nassau County Police for many, many years. They were legendary, the Looney family in Nassau County. They've been there for generations. And in fact, the earlier Looneys were involved in some of the early flights that took off from Mitchell Field and Roosevelt Field. You know, like, who's the guy that went overseas? Lindbergh, thank you. I need this guy, you see, because I'm getting old, you can tell, right? So what happens to you when you get old? You start to forget the names, that's the thing. And I get it, and he's there to keep me going, right, on that one. So, but Charles Lindbergh, the Loonies were involved in all that in the early days of aviation. They were really interesting people. And Francis Looney became the chief of police or commissioner, I forget which, and his chief assistant was George Heuermann all those years. So they were highly connected to not only the police department, but the Loonies were also highly connected to the Catholic Church and the Roman Catholic Church. And there's nothing, I'm not implicating the Loonies in any way. They're great, great people. I knew them. I grew up with the Loonies. Walter Looney recommended me for a scholarship in London when I went to undergraduate and studied over there. So I've known the Loonies, and they're good people, but they were important people too, very important in both the Catholic faith as well as the police department. So for George Heuermann to be involved in that, and his aunt was a nun. Yeah, and she's still alive. She's I think she's 100 years old or something like that, and she's in a nun's nursing home up in Syosset, I believe. But she was for years, 30 years, she was an important figure at Holy Trinity High School, and that was part of the Heuermann family. So they're not all bad, and but some of them are more than one. You know. Yeah. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So, Heuermann, from what you had said, we assume that did not kill Shannan Gilbert. The people that did kill Shannan Gilbert, people or persons, do you believe that they have killed others that were involved in this case? Because there's obviously more than 5, but
Yeah.
are they responsible for other ones as well?
This is another question we've brooded about as well. It's a good question. It's a great question. I don't say that Heuermann is not involved in Shannan Gilbert. I don't know if he is or not. Okay? And I've said that before when I've been asked. I adhere to that. There are some odd coincidences. For example, that he's a hunter, and it appears that Shannan was hunted. It also appears that other women were hunted. We know that some of the items that were seized by the police in Heuermann's house were something that they called survivalist items. And survivalism is, as maybe as some of you are, these are people who believe, the nuclear war's coming, the world's coming to an end, that kind of thing, and they're getting ready for it. So they build huts in the woods, and they store foods, and they do all kinds of things to be surviving, and they call themselves survivalists. And Peter Hackett ran a company called Survivalist Dynamics. And it was run with a man who was a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy up in Kings Point area up there. And he and Hackett ran this survivalist operation. So they're 20 minutes away as they drive, 10 minutes as the crow flies from each other. And this is a very peculiar movement where on the internet, with today's standards, everybody gets to know everybody who's involved in their movement. The chances that he and Hackett knew each other are pretty good. But, proof, that's not proof yet. All right, does that help? As far as others being concerned, to answer that rest of your question, it's strictly inference and opinion. We don't have the solid evidence yet, but all of it points to that there are other people involved in various ways. You know, not necessarily that they're the killers, but, you know, it, I don't want to be, you know, a preacher in church, but I mean, the moral atmosphere that's created, and by moral I mean the opposite, the immoral atmosphere, that's created by these people over the course of years with the sexual revolution, and everything is okay, and everything goes, has led to these murders. Because it's in that muck that these people operate, and it's muck. And Burke was in it. There's no better example of that than that. He goes up in Farmingville and asks to give a man an oral sex, when he knows very well, up on Bald Hill, any of you that have lived here long enough know very well, it's a notorious place for that to happen. People don't go there and eat their lunches because they're accosted all the time. And I know that because I have clients for several years coming up, they're getting busted. So he knew that they were getting busted, and yet he took the risk and went there because he's a really sick pervert. You think he just became that now? Or was he doing that with the two, Loretta Rickenbacker, who, by the way, just passed away in December, his girlfriend, who was my client, by the way. I helped her too once she came to me as a result of this case. I said, all right, I stepped up and helped her out in her cases. And she just died, but when he was having sex with Loretta in his police car on Albany Avenue over there in the notorious drug-infested place, well, he was supposed to be investigating drugs. And he wasn't just having normal sex, he was having the most outrageous sex you ever heard of in the back seat of the car. That muck exists. That muck is everywhere. And that's why all these swingers clubs thrive, like La Trapeze in New York, for all these years. You know, it's the Oasis over in Smithtown, you know, where there's a list of over 140 prominent people who went there and were doing swapping, swingers, you know, that kind of thing. That all is what has brought this, in my opinion. He was a swinger, Heuermann. And you know, it's funny, when I brought that up, some reporters said to me, and one very prominent reporter from a very prominent national newspaper said to me, what's wrong with that? So what that they were swingers? Everybody is. That's what he said. That's what brought this on. So there are plenty of guilty parties. Some of them don't even know it. That's my answer. Any other questions?
So kind of know each other, then Burke and Heuermann? Maybe
Yeah,
that's
we
like
think,
what-
I am reasonably certain that Burke and Heuermann knew each other.
Because the original police investigation way back when covered up the fact that one of the victims was a boyfriend or something, said that they met Heuermann. He was a big, tall guy. He had a green Avalanche, like a car that's not that
Right.
lived somewhere in Massachusetts. That would have taken not too long to find that guy, I would think.
Right.
So I'm wondering if he didn't want them to go over to that area and find Heuermann Burke, you know, because maybe they were somehow in cahoots.
Anything's possible like that, a lot of reasonable inferences involved, but it's more likely than not that Burke and Heuermann personally knew each other. All right, and when you get to my January 30th, you'll see that. We have some interesting evidence about that, okay? So, you know, I hope I can see you all. Anyway, I think that I'm being told nicely, gently, that my time is over. And I'm delighted with you folks, all of you. I wish I could get to know you each and your names at least even, but I thank you for giving me this time and attention. And I think that I'm just looking around, and some people I can tell by faces, because I watch juries all the time, right? I watch their faces intimately and say, oh, Christ, that one's against me, you know? You're my jury that's not against me, so I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.